The air hung heavy with dread. The Philistine army, a vast metallic tide, had amassed at Shunem. Their chariots and iron weapons glinted menacingly in the sunlight. Saul, king of Israel, looked out over his own meager forces. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced his heart. He, who had once been strong and confident, was now a king in name only. Years of war and bloodshed had taken their toll. The Philistines, with their superior weaponry and ruthless tactics, had pushed Israel to the brink. Saul, once chosen by God, felt his faith wavering. His prayers went unanswered. Silence met his pleas for guidance. The weight of his kingdom, his people, pressed down upon him.
He remembered the early days of his reign, the victories, the divine favor. He had been a young man then, full of fire and faith. Now, the fire was dying, leaving behind only ashes and despair. The Philistines were at his doorstep, and he, the king, felt powerless to stop them. Despair, like a venomous serpent, coiled around his heart, squeezing the last vestiges of hope from him. The future seemed a bleak and terrifying abyss.
Night fell, cloaking the camp in an unsettling darkness. The air was thick with tension, and the only sounds were the distant cries of nocturnal creatures and the occasional rustle of leaves. The campfires flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows that danced on the tents. Saul paced his tent, his armor heavy, his thoughts heavier still. Each step echoed his inner turmoil, a relentless rhythm of doubt and fear. His mind raced with the weight of his decisions, the consequences of his actions, and the looming threat that hung over his kingdom. He had driven away those who practiced divination, those who claimed to speak to the dead. They had been banished, their practices condemned as heresy. The camp had once been filled with their whispers and rituals, but now it was silent, a silence that seemed to mock him. He had considered it an abomination, a defiance of God. The sacred texts were clear, and Saul had been resolute in his enforcement of the divine laws. He had believed that by purging these practices, he was protecting his people, ensuring their favor with the Almighty. But now, in his desperation, the forbidden path beckoned. It was a path shrouded in mystery and danger, a path that he had sworn never to tread. Yet, as the shadows of doubt crept into his heart, he found himself drawn to it, unable to resist its dark allure. There was a woman, a medium, in Endor. She was known to those who sought forbidden knowledge, a keeper of secrets that lay beyond the veil of death. Her presence was a whisper in the night, a promise of answers that eluded him. Rumors of her powers had reached even the king's ears. They spoke of her ability to commune with the spirits, to summon the dead from their eternal rest. These whispers had been dismissed as mere superstition, but now they seemed like a lifeline, a glimmer of hope in his darkest hour. It was said she could summon the spirits of the dead. Was it madness? Perhaps. But in his desperation, Saul was willing to grasp at any straw, no matter how thin. The thought of speaking to the departed, of seeking their counsel, was both terrifying and tantalizing. But what choice did he have? The weight of his crown had never felt heavier, and the silence of God was a void that threatened to consume him. He stood at the precipice, staring into the abyss, knowing that his next step could lead to salvation or damnation. The Philistines were at his doorstep, and God was silent. The enemy's forces were vast and formidable, their intentions clear. Saul's own warriors prepared for battle, their faces grim, their hearts steeled for the fight ahead. But without divine guidance, their courage wavered.
"Find the woman," he commanded his servants, his voice a strained whisper, barely audible above the pounding of his heart. "Bring her to me, and tell no one." His words were laced with urgency, a plea masked as an order. He knew the risks, but desperation had clouded his judgment.
They looked at him, their eyes wide with fear and apprehension. They had seen their king in many states, but never like this. His desperation was palpable, a tangible force that seemed to seep into the very air around them. They knew of his decree against such practices. It had been a cornerstone of his reign, a symbol of his commitment to divine law. To defy it now was unthinkable, yet they could not ignore the command of their king. But they also saw the desperation etched on his face. They dared not disobey. His eyes, once filled with the fire of conviction, now held a haunted look, a reflection of the torment within. They knew that to refuse him would be to abandon him in his hour of need. Under the cover of darkness, they slipped out of the camp. Their movements were swift and silent, their hearts pounding with the fear of discovery. Each step took them further from the safety of the camp and closer to the unknown. Their mission was dangerous, their hearts heavy. They were acutely aware of the gravity of their task, the thin line they walked between loyalty and treachery. The night seemed to close in around them, a cloak of shadows that mirrored their own fears. They were about to do what their king had forbidden, to dabble in the dark arts that he himself had condemned. The irony was not lost on them, and it weighed heavily on their minds. They were stepping into a world of uncertainty, where the boundaries of right and wrong blurred, but desperation makes fools of us all. It drives us to actions we would never consider in the light of day, to choices that haunt us long after they are made. And Saul, the once mighty king, was now drowning in it. His desperation was a mirror reflecting the fears and doubts of those who served him. And Saul, the once mighty king, was now drowning in it. His kingdom, his faith, his very soul seemed to hang in the balance. The path he had chosen was fraught with peril, but it was a path he felt compelled to take. For in the silence of the night, with the weight of his crown pressing down upon him, he sought answers that only the forbidden could provide. The journey to Endor was fraught with peril. The path was treacherous, winding through ancient landscapes that seemed to whisper secrets of old. The night was their cloak, but it was also their enemy, shrouding dangers that lurked in the shadows. The Philistine patrols roamed the countryside, their presence a constant threat. These soldiers were vigilant, their eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The travelers knew that one misstep could mean capture or worse. Every rustle of leaves, every cry of a night bird sent shivers down their spines. The night was alive with sounds, each one a potential harbinger of doom. They moved cautiously, their senses heightened, every nerve on edge. Finally, they reached the woman's dwelling, a humble hut on the outskirts of the village. It was a modest abode, almost blending into the landscape, but it held the promise of answers they desperately sought. Smoke curled from its chimney, casting an eerie glow in the darkness. The sight was both comforting and unsettling, a beacon in the night that hinted at the mysteries within. The woman greeted them, her eyes sharp and knowing. She seemed to see through them, her gaze piercing the veil of their intentions. There was a wisdom in her eyes, a depth of understanding that was both reassuring and intimidating. She was old, her face etched with the passage of time, but her gaze held a youthful intensity. Her features told a story of a life lived through countless seasons, each wrinkle a testament to her experiences. When she saw the king's servants, a flicker of recognition crossed her features. She knew why they had come, and the weight of their request settled heavily upon her.
"What brings you to my humble abode?" she asked, her voice raspy with age. There was a challenge in her tone, a demand for honesty.
"The king summons you," one of the servants replied, his voice trembling. The weight of their mission was evident in his tone, a mixture of fear and urgency. "He commands you to summon a spirit for him." The words hung in the air, heavy with the gravity of their request. The woman hesitated, her eyes narrowing. She knew the dangers of what they asked, the risks involved in meddling with the spirits.
"You know the penalty for such a request," she said, her voice low and menacing. Her words were a stark reminder of the laws that governed their land. The king himself has outlawed such practices. The decree was clear, and the consequences of defying it were severe.
"He knows," the servant replied, his voice barely a whisper. "But he is desperate." The urgency in his voice was palpable, a reflection of the dire situation they faced. The Philistines are upon us, and God does not answer his prayers. The battlefield loomed in their minds, a place of impending doom where the fate of their people would be decided. The woman looked at them for a long moment, her gaze piercing their very souls. She weighed their words, the desperation in their eyes, and the gravity of their request. Then she nodded slowly.
"Very well," she said. "Bring me your king." Her acceptance was a reluctant one, a decision made with the full knowledge of the consequences that lay ahead.
The air crackled with anticipation. Saul sat opposite the woman, his face hidden in the shadows. Fear and anticipation warred within him. He had come seeking guidance, but what if he found only damnation?
"Who do you wish me to summon?"
Samuel. Summon Samuel for me.
The woman began to chant, her voice low and rhythmic, the words ancient and strange. The air grew heavy. The shadows seemed to dance and writhe. Saul closed his eyes, his heart pounding against his ribs. He could feel a presence, cold and ethereal, entering the room. The chanting intensified, the air growing thick and oppressive. Saul felt a cold sweat break out on his skin. He opened his eyes, and what he saw made his blood run cold. A figure was rising from the ground, a spectral form shrouded in mist and shadow. It was an old man, his face gaunt, his eyes burning with an unearthly light. Saul knew instantly who it was. Samuel, his old mentor, his prophet, his friend. He had come back from the grave at Saul's behest, but there was no warmth in his eyes, no recognition, only a cold, detached curiosity.
Samuel. Samuel, can you hear me?
Saul cried out, his voice hoarse with emotion. His cries echoed through the night, filled with a desperation that seemed to pierce the very fabric of reality.
Why have you disturbed me? Why do you call upon me from the grave?
The specter asked, his voice hollow and echoing. Saul's heart sank, a cold dread seeping into his bones. He had hoped for guidance, for solace, but found only judgment. Even in death, Samuel's disapproval was palpable. It was as if the weight of his past mistakes bore down on him, magnified by the spectral presence. He explained his predicament, the Philistines, his fear, God's silence. His words tumbled out in a rush, a torrent of anxiety and dread. He spoke of the battles lost, the enemies at his gates, and the deafening silence from the heavens. As he spoke, the spectral figure of Samuel remained impassive, his eyes boring into Saul's very soul. Those eyes, once filled with wisdom and guidance, now seemed to judge him, to see through his very being. When Saul finished, Samuel spoke, his voice echoing through the small hut. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper, as if the very world held its breath.
Why do you consult me? For the Lord has departed from you and become your enemy. Why seek answers from the dead when the living God has turned away?
Saul trembled, his worst fears confirmed. God had abandoned him. The realization hit him like a physical blow, leaving him reeling, his mind a whirl of despair.
The Lord has done as he spoke through me. His words were final, a decree from beyond the grave. He has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David. The crown that once symbolized his power and authority now felt like a shackle, a reminder of his failures.
Saul recoiled as if struck. The name David echoed in his mind, a name that brought both admiration and envy. David, his former shepherd, his rival, the one he both admired and envied. The young man who had once played the harp to soothe his troubled mind, now the chosen one to replace him.
Tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. The words were a chilling prophecy, a foretelling of doom that left no room for hope.
The words hung in the air, a death knell to Saul's hopes. The finality of it all settled over him like a shroud, suffocating and inescapable. The specter began to fade, sinking back into the earth from which it had come. The light dimmed, the shadows lengthened, and the coldness of the grave seemed to seep into the very walls of the hut.
Samuel, wait! Tell me what to do! Is there no hope? His voice cracked, a plea born of utter desperation, but it was too late.
But the specter was gone, leaving Saul alone with his despair. The silence that followed was deafening, a void that swallowed his cries and left him with nothing but the weight of his impending doom.